Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've been making our way toward the Pequot War and the consolidation of Puritan power in New England. We've developed the mindset of Massachusetts Bay Colony. We've looked at some of the people that challenged the magistrates. Last week, we began to develop the first of three men, a trilogy that would help the Bible state achieve its goal of supremacy. We spent our time together talking about the second Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, and the role that he played in driving John Edward Underhill to flee to the Netherlands. His son, our prime focus of this story, John Underhill, was very young at the time they fled England. He would live almost 30 years in Holland among the English expats that had settled there. This was largely a Puritan community that predated the Pilgrims of Leiden. For all intents and purposes, John Underhill lived a full life here. He was educated and came of age serving under Philip Willem, Prince of Orange, and married a Dutch woman named Helena or Heilken de Hooch. His time in service would serve as the tutor for his life's work, namely fighting and serving in various administrative capacities in the New World. Philip William, the Prince of Orange, was the eldest son of William of Orange, remembered by many as William the Silent. And we spent a lot of time on William the Silent in one of our first episodes, so we're not going to go into too much detail right here. But you'll recall his leadership and dedication had transferred from the service of the King of Spain, Philip, to his assigned subjects in the Netherlands. You remember, William got his nickname after he remained silent when he heard of the Spanish plot to wipe out the Protestants in the Netherlands. And upon his assassination in 1584, his eldest son, Philip William, became the Prince of Orange. He actually had an interesting life himself. Philip William's mother was Anna von Egmont, William of Orange's first wife, and she died when Philip William was very young. At 13, in 1568, because of his father's disobedience to the Duke of Alva, young Philip was taken to Spain. He was part hostage, but the real goal was to keep him loyal to the Spanish crown. His father had a title and influence that he may one day inherit. And he would not return to the Netherlands for almost 30 years. And no, he'd never see his father again. When he did return to the Netherlands, after some challenges, he was accepted as the Lord of Breda and Steenbergen. And there was a catch. Although he was now a Catholic, he was not to challenge the Protestant Church. Now, he did celebrate Catholic services in the castle, but he did not challenge the Protestant leadership in Breda. He appointed magistrates that maintained the, quote, Union and Republic's religion, end quote. And there was a time in 1613 that this agreement was strained, but Philip William ultimately complied with the military governor of Breda, an illegitimate half-brother, Justinius van Nassau. Now, stay with me here. This all leads to a better understanding of just how intertwined all these guys, as individuals and societies, actually were. I mean, this has significance in the life of John Underhill and the colonies that he would one day live in. Like his father, Philip William married well. Eleanor was the cousin of Henry IV of France, Henry Navarre, the Protestant. So it was in the service of the Prince of Orange that John Underhill came of age, transplanted at an early age from England to the Netherlands, living among the Puritans, serving within a system that recognized both Catholic and Protestant boundaries, where the United Republic was placed, albeit reluctantly at times, above the preferences of the individuals. John Underhill had borne witness to the danger of disloyalty and the success that unity can offer. He had grown up in an environment with both strong personal opinions and convictions and tolerance. In 1630, John Underhill moved himself, his wife, and their baby girl, Deborah, to Massachusetts Bay. He had been hired to help train the militia. Like Miles Standish in Plymouth, he was given the rank of captain. Unlike Miles Standish, John Underhill's presence and influence would come to dwarf his original assignment. John Underhill would prove to be a versatile, driven man. I think he was a man who preferred tolerance, a character trait that would cost him along the way. But he was also a bit of an opportunist. He wanted action. He wanted his side to win. He sought action. He sought victory. And upon his arrival in Massachusetts Bay, he quickly expanded his public role. In 1634, he was appointed to the General Court as well as elected a Boston selectman. And not long after those positions were obtained, he was sent to arrest Roger Williams. It was early in 1636. You recall Williams had challenged the magistrates on the freedom of conscience and individual property rights, among other things. It was John Underhill who had been sent to arrest and deport Roger Williams back to England. But when he arrived, Williams had already fled to the Rhode Island area. Now, at this point, I would have loved to have interviewed John Underhill. Remember, he had firsthand experience with challenging the power base. He had firsthand experience knowing how it felt to lose that challenge. He had come of age in an environment where tolerance was the preferred method, where real, dangerous divisions in other regions were causing death and destruction. He was doing his duty, but I wonder what he thought as he traveled to Roger Williams's house. It was not long after the Roger Williams controversy occurred that Anne Hutchinson and the antinomian controversy arose in 1638. Now, hold that thought. Put a finger in that page. Here's where the overlap of so many pivotal events begins to define so many men, and the emerging situation itself of an ambitious, growing Massachusetts Bay colony. In our last mini-series, our last chapter, we looked at the dual controversies surrounding Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson as if they had happened back to back, almost without interruption. Now, I did qualify that there was other stuff going on, but I didn't really elaborate on that. But now we want to a little bit. I think it's important to both fully understand each type of challenge, but also recognize that there was more to the chronology than just a neat little series of events that burn themselves out before the next series of events occurs. That's not how things happen. That's not how things happened back then, and it's not how things happen today. Sometimes it seems to me, as I watch current events unfold, the various talking heads or even people around me, their personal opinions, espousing their various views, seem to almost not realize that their pet peeve of the day may not be the only thing going on. It may not be the biggest thing going on. It may not even have any real relevance to anything substantial. And the solutions that they suggest sometimes do not reflect either the true gravity of the situation or the complexity. And this is one of those times. There was a lot going on, and they were multitasking. The other pressing event for the Bible state, as well as the other Puritan colonies, was the looming, growing trouble with the Pequot Nation. Now, this was a big deal with a lot of moving parts. The actual fighting part of the war was brief, but the before and the after events are worth extended consideration, which we'll do in just a few weeks. But for now, to get a better understanding of who John Underhill was, let's look at some cold, hard facts, or cold-hearted facts about the man himself. As we've discussed, John Underhill had had quite a life already, living in exile, no doubt being well informed of the politics and the social issues of his day, serving in the Netherlands and then moving to North America. He'd been brought over as a militia trainer and had, in very short order, been elevated within the Puritan society. He had achieved a level of prominence. And so before we talk too much about John Underhill, the specifics, I want to develop a train of thought here. It's kind of a weird thing. People of prominence and definitions of what prominence is vary, but people that each of us admire and recognize as influential are often placed on a pedestal, even if it's only a mental pedestal. We seem to think that they're above unnecessary extravagance or abuses. I said unnecessary. We can easily overlook or excuse some indiscretion as long as they are performing to the expectation that we have of them. We do it with our politicians. We do it with our entertainers. We do it with professional athletes. It's not a weakness that's confined to one side or the other, as if there's only two sides, but it's rather a common, almost universal problem. And it is a problem. Often the framers of our popular history have done the same thing. That allowance, if unchecked, seldom checks itself. The appetite grows, and the appealing nature of those most admired can become less appealing the more we know. The flip side is that institutions and events seldom occur or exist in a vacuum. Beware of anybody who offers quick solutions to complex problems. Beware of anyone who offers quick solutions that offer but a single dimension to the problem. Chances are that's an incomplete idea at best, or a bad idea altogether. Beware of any biography that paints a one-sided picture. I'm not one-sided, you're not one-sided, nobody is. That doesn't mean there are no evil people, but most people have a mixed bag based on their talents or opportunities or events that present themselves. And so with those thoughts in mind, let's take another look at the young, ambitious John Underhill, a man with a young family, a second daughter at this point, and a growing responsibility within his community. Remember, his primary responsibility was militia training, organizing the military defenses of the colony, which he had done when he began the construction of the fortification on Castle Island outside of Boston. He would also be used for offensive maneuvers to protect the colony, and as we'll see, the colony's interests. So when trouble began to come in the form of hostilities with the Pequot Nation, it was only a matter of time before things boiled over. We'll cover those later, but for now, I want to use the defining event as an example of the other side of the coin, another man that John Underhill could become. I will say John Underhill was loyal to the cause, loyal to his own. Well, loyal to his own ambition and to the task at hand. I'm sure he was capable of projecting all of the niceties that society would expect, but he's a controversial figure. One of those guys that behind the scenes did the dirty work that ultimately consolidated the power of the Puritans. There were many men like John Underhill that would come and go from the scene for the next several hundred years that did the dirty work. Men whose actions we still benefit from. And I want to be careful to remain honest to the history, but keep in mind their world was very different than ours. And to the victor go the spoils. But I also want to be able to call foul when it seems foul to me. There were many aspects of violence on both sides, or all sides, leading up to the Pequot War. There was also the growing tension between the Dutch and the English, growing competition between the various native tribes and Europeans over the fur trade, growing wampum trade. There was the production of wampum. It was like having a money-making machine. There are two things that stand out about the Pequot War. Well, two things that I want to develop in addition to the series of unfortunate events that led to the destruction of the Pequots. They were the dominant tribe. They were challenged, but they were dominant. The first thing is that it represents the first major large-scale military operation between the Europeans and the native tribes of lasting consequence. To be clear, there were plenty of native groups that took part in the assault of the Pequots. And secondly, it had to do with money, control of the wampum, and from that, a good chunk of the fur trade and control over the natives. So in 1636, John Underhill, after being elevated in position and stature, had gone to arrest Roger Williams. Then the following year, after much trouble, John Underhill and a militia raised from the Massachusetts Bay in Saybrook Colony in present-day Connecticut, along with Mohegan and Narragansett allies, set out to destroy the fortified Pequot village at Mystic. In the early morning hours, they set fire to the village and surrounded the stockade twice around. As the Pequots attempted to flee, they were cut down by the hundreds. Men, women, children, without distinction, without mercy. Stop for a minute. Picture that scene. Consider the adrenaline, the noises, the fear, the screams, the unnecessary carnage. Picture your family inside the stockade. And did I mention, this was a case of almost mistaken villages to boot. It was not the prime village of warriors. Many of them were away at the time, where the fighting is, man on man. But it's old people, it's women and children. As the dawn broke, they simply tried to get away, any way they could. And John Underhill was one of the guys in charge of this massacre. It was designed to be a massacre. Again, think about the terror and the carnage that was perpetrated. The gallant Englishmen of military prowess carrying out the wholesale slaughter of American hostiles to a level that they, the natives, were not accustomed to. For all of the huff and puff about their carnality, once again, they appear to be not only the victims, but more humane. There's two quotes that I want to read right now to put into context who John Underhill was, what he was capable of. And again, this is the story of John Underhill. The story of the Pequot destruction will come a little bit later in our series in a much fuller context. There's a lot to it. It's the level of brutality that John Underhill was capable of that we want to isolate right here. Not with the lens of 21st century spectacles, but through theirs, the men of that day. Not with revisionist, but originalist history. The dirty work being done, deeds not always reported by the victors, as even their audience in their world may have objected. But the natives were not Christian, so less consideration was required, less explanation was required. The first quote comes from Guy Chet in his book, Conquering the American Wilderness. Now, this is a little bit lengthy, but I just want to give you the narrative of how this went down. At daybreak, Mason arrived within view of the fort on the western side of the hill. He sent Underhill's contingent to the southern slope, and after allowing them enough time to get into position, he started his approach toward the palisade. Despite their silent advance, the English were detected by the Pequot dogs. The English fired through the palisade and then charged both entrances to the fort simultaneously. Quote, having our swords in our right hand, our carbines or muskets in our left, end quote. When the Indians started firing from within their huts, Mason ordered a retreat. He and Underhill blocked the entrances to the fort and then set it on fire, stoking the fire with gunpowder. The English and their Indian allies formed two rings around the burning fort. Those who escaped the fire were, quote, received by the soldiers and entertained with the point of the sword, end quote. Mason's force suffered 2 fatalities and 20 casualties. Of Mystic's 600 inhabitants, only 7 survived. Despite this seemingly decisive victory, Mason's force was still in a dangerous position, deep in enemy territory, 7 miles away from the rendezvous point with their boats, and burdened with 20 casualties. Soon after Mystic was raised, roughly 500 Pequot warriors, led by Sausakus, arrived from the larger, stronger Pequot fortress on the Pequot River. They rushed toward Mason's retreating troops. 2 files at the rear, each 8 strong, under Underhill's command, fired volleys at the charging Pequots to inhibit or delay their pursuit, while Mason, leading the column, pressed forward to the boats. After this first volley, the Pequots kept their distance. They kept harassing the English and impeding their retreat by firing from behind rocks and trees, but they did not charge them. Quote, the Pequots came upon us with their prime men and let fly at us, but they, finding our bullets to outreach their arrows, forced themselves after to retreat, end quote. According to John Mason, the English even had time enough to stop at the river's bank to refresh themselves. Quote, having by that time taught the Pequots a little more manners than to disturb us, end quote. Mason's advancing force cleared the thickets ahead of these snipers with musket fire. By the time Mason got to within 2 miles of Pequot Harbor, the Pequots had abandoned the battlefield. At one point during this retreat, the Mohegans and Narragansetts charged the Pequots. Observing their mode of combat, John Underhill remarked that, quote, they might fight 7 years and not kill 7 men, end quote. He felt the settlers' Indian allies were surprised and impressed by the Europeans' method of combat. They were unaccustomed to such wholesale slaughter as took place at Mystic, and were in awe of the ferocity and deadliness of the Englishmen, end quote. Inside of that narrative by Guy Chet were quotes from both John Mason and John Underhill themselves. Actually, the native allies were disgusted with the English. The enemies, and often victims of the Pequots, thought that the English went too far. This wouldn't be the end. There would be much more to come. One more quote that I'd like to read on this from Karen Ordahl Kupperman reads this way, quote, given the general assumption that the native life involved unceasing war and vengeful cruelty, it is surprising to see that most English observers found Indian warfare to be understated, almost trivial. Captain John Mason said the Indians fought in the Pequot War, quote, after their feeble manner, end quote. Roger Williams wrote that, quote, their wars are far less bloody and devouring than the cruel wars of Europe, and seldom 20 slain in a particular field. Captain John Underhill, who led English forces in the Pequot War, agreed, quote, they might fight 7 years and not kill 7 men, end quote. Their warfare was, quote, more for pastime than to conquer and subdue enemies, end quote. The Pequots were pursued to what the English thought was their extinction. And this forms a striking contrast to native modes of warfare. Opechancanough, I think that's how you pronounce it, Opechancanough, led devastating attacks on the English settlements in Virginia in 1622 and 1644. And both times the colonists were reeling in their aftermath, but neither was followed up by continued assaults. Thus, the opportunity to destroy the plantations altogether was foregone. American war was premised on the assumption that a defeated enemy would withdraw. Earlier in Virginia, Henry Spelman had seen a battle between the Podsworth and the Massachusetts that ended as soon as the Massachusetts had shot all of their arrows without much result. Williams said that the battles usually ended as soon as some were wounded, end quote. So again, Kupperman gave us quotes from Roger Williams and John Underhill. What we see is that the natives were not always more humane, but generally it was the norm not to be as barbarous. They were driven to that. They weren't the bloodthirsty savages that they were portrayed. They were people. We've seen in the earlier engagements with the English colonials in New England that the natives were far more helpful than they were harmful. So there's that. The upwardly mobile, dashing young John Underhill was a merciless killer. Planned, premeditated, merciless. Not necessarily the hardened soldier facing another hardened soldier on the field of battle here. Add that to his resume. I mean, there will be many more campaigns in the service of both the English and the Dutch that go about the same way. Complete destruction. Total war. What do you think of total war? How does it make you feel? Not the knee-jerk revenge kind of stuff, but when you really think about it, what does the thought of total war mean to you? Is there etiquette in war? Should there be etiquette in war? How do you know that you'll have beaten the opponent enough that they will bend to your will? Men in battle have to think about these things. And I'm not justifying actions here, not condemning them, not justifying them. I'm trying to rationalize what goes through men's minds when in the field. Forget all the previous provocations. I mean, once these guys were here, they knew they were attacking a very formidable opponent, a terror to every other native tribe in the region. Anyway, this line of thinking should help people to realize the significance of the art of war. It is as ugly as death itself. No matter the heroic or the courageous spin someone might try to attach to it, it's ugly. Depending on what side of the fight you are on or how your culture benefits, men who do the dirty work are either blessings or curses. So things are moving very quickly. Militia organizer, Castle Island defenses, administrative promotions, the Roger Williams controversy, the Pequots. On the heels of all of this, first came the Anne Hutchinson antinomian controversy, then the fallout of an adulterous affair. Yes, John Underhill was busy in all sorts of ways. You see the rapid fire from all angles. I mean, life was just moving fast. These guys lived in a world without modern conveniences. Can you imagine all of this going on without modern conveniences? They were very busy. John Underhill was busier than most. I mean, do you still have your finger in the page that I told you to hold a few minutes ago? Because we're coming back to that now. After all of his service to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and by all accounts he had served their purposes, John Underhill was caught up in the antinomian controversy. Remember, he was in Boston. That was where the majority of the Hutchinson, Vane, Wheelwright support had come from. Underhill was one of their guys. He had signed the Boston Petition in support of John Wheelwright. Now, you'll recall from a previous episode that John Wheelwright had fled to New Hampshire. And so with this controversy, John Underhill lost his appointment to the General Court and his selectmanship. He was banished in 1638. To add insult to injury, he was excommunicated in 1640. That might not be such a big deal in modern times, but back then, excommunication from your local church was a big deal. It's practically tantamount to social and ecclesiastical death sentence. The loss of position as well as banishment was about the support of Wheelwright. The excommunication was about adultery. Now, adultery in general is recognized as a no-no in most cultures, but it could be almost unpardonable in Puritan New England. With this turn of events, John Underhill left Massachusetts Bay and moved to England. It seems kind of strange to me. He had really only been born in England. I mean, almost all of his European life had taken place on the continent in the Netherlands. His wife was Dutch, but he went to London. I guess his fortunes could go either way at this point. I mean, it wouldn't be hard to believe if he'd experienced a lot of success. He was ambitious. He would surely have had some contacts in London, but he did not experience a lot of success. And, for the record, in a case of endorsing two diametrically opposed positions simultaneously, it also seems logical that he couldn't find work. I mean, for all the typical reasons, but also there would be some questions. I mean, what was the reputation of his immediate family line like with the people in charge in London at this time? I mean, after all, there had been that nasty little incident with the Earl of Essex. What was his reputation within the Puritan community? I mean, he'd not only been banished, but excommunicated by very influential men in Massachusetts Bay. So he headed back to the colonies, his poor wife. Imagine the energy, the expense, the toll that these moves, not to mention the precipitating events leading to these moves, would have taken on her. I mean, I wonder what their relationship was like. Remember, she had a powerful family herself. I mean, she was a Bourbon. I wonder if the Netherlands or France ever crossed their minds. Or even the French colonies in North America. I mean, I'm just kind of wondering out loud about that, you know? I mean, this wasn't a lazy guy. He made a few errors in judgment, but he wasn't stupid. He wasn't without experience, and he certainly wasn't without a killer instinct, whether it's metaphorical or literal. We learned that at Mystic. So he headed to Boston, but was there just long enough to sell his property before heading to New Hampshire. The New Hampshire of John Mason. Now the New Hampshire of John Wheelwright. Non-Puritan, or at least religious liberty-minded New Hampshire, beyond the reach of Massachusetts Bay's leadership. He settled in Dover, like Wheelwright had done. And just like with Anne Hutchinson, John Winthrop was not done yet. He made attempts to sour the reputation of Captain Underhill among the folks in New Hampshire. It didn't work. Underhill actually became governor. And what a life. Add that to his resume. Whether you like him or not, John Underhill is another one of these guys that really did pack like 3 lifetimes into one, like John Mason and Ferdinand Gorges. I mean, and don't think we're done. We're far from done with this guy. Not even half of it. I mean that. This guy's exploits have not reached the halfway point yet. Soldier, militia commander, selectman, general court appointee, governor, mass murderer, adulterer, heretic. I'm sorry, it's just too easy. Anyway, he's an impressive guy to think about, an impressive character that just took society by storm. So I wonder if I would have liked this guy. I mean, he had flaws, but we all do. But capturing an image of him in his world at that time, in those places, those experiences, what do you think you would have thought of John Underhill had you met him back then? Be careful not to answer that too fast. He's a complicated guy. So many men who have accomplished much are multifaceted. Even thieves are good to their own children, and their children love them. So there was the charge of adultery by John Winthrop and company. And when I first read it, I thought, before I read any detail, I thought maybe it was a lie. The Puritan leadership lying about Underhill like they did about Anne Hutchinson. Except John Underhill owned the charge. I would have been a little intimidated to treat him with the same venom as Hutchinson. I mean, he seems a little unhinged. He seems like he's capably unhinged. It was around this time, according to Light and Blue Sky Delgado, from the website Montauk Warrior, in a paper entitled John Underhill, Religious Maniac and Mass Murderer, less than a year after the Mystic Massacre, Underhill struck again. This time it had been in Muncie Village, in today's Westchester County, New York State. He wiped out the entire village, over 500 people. Now, I was unable to corroborate this event. I was leery to include it because of that, but it does fit a pattern that will emerge a little bit later in Underhill's life, and it certainly fits the Mystic campaign. And frankly, that was part of my hesitation. I mean, it's easy to just start pinning stuff on a guy because it fits his character. But Delgado's paper actually hits the mark on a bunch of other things. So I wanted to include this at least, just to give us, again, a fuller picture of John Underhill, who he was, what his reputation might have been. But there will be more events like these first two. And if it's true, I might have left him alone. I might have just been glad that he had left the colony. John Underhill did not just own the charge of adultery. He prostrated himself before the Massachusetts Bay leadership to have the charges dropped. He managed to get unbanished and unexcommunicated in 1641. John Winthrop recorded the proceedings this way in his journal, which was dated September 3rd, 1640. First of all, he said that Underhill appeared, quote, in old clothes and a foul linen cap. Winthrop said he was very repentant. I guess Underhill understood that full prostration was required. Winthrop's recordings of the event go like this. Now, I apologize, it's a little long, but I think it's worth the read or the listen. It's always good to get the words of the guys that were there. When we're done, I'll point out just a couple of things that were odd, not because I don't think you'll pick up on them, but because it is kind of a lengthy quote. So Winthrop says that Underhill showed up in old clothes and a foul linen cap, apologized abjectly, weeping and blubbering and sighing. And it worked. Winthrop said this in his journal, quote, Captain Underhill, being brought by the blessing of God in this church's censure of excommunication to remorse for his foul sins, obtained by means of the elders and others of the Church of Boston, a safe conduct under the hand of the governor and of the council to repair the church. He came at the time of the court of assistance, and upon the lecture day, after sermon, the pastor called him forth and declared the occasion, and then gave him leave to speak. And indeed, it was a spectacle which caused many weeping eyes, though it afforded matter of much rejoicing. And behold, the power of the Lord Jesus in his ordinances, when they are dispensed in his own way, holding forth the authority of his legal scepter in the complicity of the gospel. He came in his worst clothes, being accustomed to take great pride in his bravery and his neatness, without a band, in a foul linen cap, pulled close to his eyes, and standing upon a form, he did with many deep sighs and abundance of tears lay open his wicked course, his adultery, his hypocrisy, his persecution of God's people here, and especially his pride, as the root of all, which caused God to give him over to this other sinful courses, and contempt of the magistrates. He justified God and the church and the court in all that had been inflicted on him. He declared what power Satan had of him since the casting out of the church, how his presumptions laying hold of mercy and pardon before God gave it, did then fail him when the terrors of God came upon him, so as he could have no rest, nor could see any issue but utter despair, which had put him divers times upon resolutions of destroying himself, had not the Lord merely prevented him, even when his sword was ready to have done the execution. Many fearful temptations he met with beside, and in all these his heart shut up in hardness and impenitency in the bondslave of Satan, till the Lord, after a long time in great affliction, had broken his heart and brought him to humble himself before him night and day with prayers and tears till his strength was wasted. And indeed he appeared as a man worn out with sorrow, and yet he could find no peace. Therefore he was now come to seek it in this ordinance of God. He spake well, save this his blubbering, etc., interrupted him. And all along he discovered a broken and melting heart, and gave good exhortation to take heed of such vanities and beginnings of evil, and had occasioned this fall. And in the end, he earnestly and humbly besought the church to have compassion of him and to deliver him out of the hands of Satan. So accordingly, he was received into the church again. And after he came into the court, for the general court began soon after, and made confession of his sin against them, etc., and desired pardon, which the court freely granted him. So as far as concerned their private judgment, but for his adultery they would not pardon that for example's sake, nor would restore him to freedom, though they released his banishment and declared the former law against adultery to be of no force, so as there was no law now to couch his life. For the new law against adultery was made since his fact committed. He confessed also in the congregation that though he was very familiar with that woman, and had gained her affection, etc., yet she withstood him 6 months against all his solicitations, which he thought no woman could have resisted, before he could overcome her chastity. But being once overcome, she was wholly at his will, and to make his peace the more sound, he went to her husband, being a cooper, and fell upon his knees before him in the presence of some of the elders and others, and confessed the wrong he had done him, and besought him to forgive him, which he did very freely. And in testimony thereof, he sent the captain's wife a token. End quote. Well, that's a very dramatic reading. It's almost Shakespearean. It's King James-esque. I guess that's the age in which they lived, isn't it? Do you think it was really that dramatic? So let's look at a couple of things here really quickly. First of all, I find it interesting right in the beginning that he states that he had to be granted safe conduct. So John Underhill, in order to come back to Massachusetts and to make sure that, as you remember, we talked about this before, that he wasn't imprisoned or have his ears cut off or tarred and feathered or whatever they might have done to him, sent him back to England, I don't know. He had to have permission to travel safely. And it's interesting, too, that he really played it up because he played up the concept of being so poor in spirit and contrite because he came in his worst clothes, even though he had a reputation for taking great pride in being a brave man and a neat man. And then it says that standing upon a form, he did with many deep sighs and abundance of tears lay open his wicked course, his adultery, his hypocrisy, his persecution of God's people here, and especially his pride as the root of all, which caused God to give him over to this other sinful courses. I mean, he's laying it on very thick. What a spectacle he's making of himself. And then it says, many fearful temptations he met with beside, and in all of these his heart shut up in hardness and in penitency as the bondslave of Satan, till the Lord, after a long time in great afflictions, had broken his heart and brought him to humble himself before him night and day with prayers and tears till his strength was wasted. Well, one would hope that this drama would be true. Or he's created the greatest heresy, and in all honesty, if you want to know the truth, that's taking the Lord's name in vain. How could anything be more taking the Lord's name in vain than the dramatic dribble that he's putting on right here for show? I don't know, maybe he was sincere. I suppose it could be. And maybe the people there really bought it. But in all honesty, this just seems like such a dramatic affair. But it goes on, you remember. It says that they gave him pardon, they freely granted him pardon, as concerned to their private judgment. But for his adultery, they would not pardon for that example's sake. So he's still considered vile and guilty, but they weren't going to do anything to him. That's basically what they said. I mean, he wasn't going to be allowed to live there anymore. And lastly, when he talks about the extramarital affair, he says that she withstood him 6 months against all his solicitations, which he thought no woman could have resisted. I mean, the guy's more than just a little arrogant, isn't he? So he prided himself on his bravery. Remember when he butchered the Pequots in partial darkness as women and children ran out of a stockade? And his handsomeness, although he came wearing clothes that made him look like a beggar. And then the scene before the woman's husband, as he drops down to his knees and he begs forgiveness. I mean, I get it. You know, and her husband forgave him, but even that, is the guy that holy and righteous? Maybe I'm missing something here, but they didn't live in a very forgiving society, did they? So you just wonder, like, did that Cooper, the woman's husband, did he really just forgive John Underhill that simply? I mean, was this staged? I don't know. So anyways, The whole thing, I said he prostrated himself. The whole thing just seems like it's just made up. They're all playing a game. So keep that in context. What went on here? As we continue with this narrative of a very busy life, I wonder what the motive really was. On both sides, Underhill would not be welcome to live in the Bible state again, but he was free and clear for all intents and purposes. It just seems out of character for him to me. It seems out of character for the Bible state, the leadership. Was he really a repentant man? Did they really believe him? Was he just a needy man? Was he a scheming man? I mean, take your pick. Ask yourself as we move forward, what was this scene really about? So with the groveling came the charges being of no real consequence. The following spring, he moved to Connecticut, where he was quickly named a freeman in Stamford. In another promotional event, he was Justice of the Stamford Court in 1643. In New Haven, at the same time, he was a deputy to the General Court. I mean, that's impressive. Now he's holding position in 2 separate colonies at the same time, after having been governor in a 3rd colony. So maybe the past would have been overlooked in Connecticut. I mean, John Hooker's view was a little more lenient than the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But it's surprising to know that the New Haven colony accepted his service. I mean, they were much stauncher on everything. You remember, they thought the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims in Plymouth were too lax. They were more stringent than both of those groups. Maybe that was why Underhill apologized. Maybe that's why these colonies accepted him. I mean, frankly, they all needed each other. And people have a way of kind of forgetting the grievances of people that they need, don't they? Don't we? Character and integrity seem to go out the window pretty quick sometimes. You know, when the culprit serves your purpose. So at any rate, John Underhill had now almost completed the circuit. He had held position of high office in Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, New Haven, and New Hampshire. He had trained and fortified and served in military capacity to the collective Puritan colonies' advantage. And in 1644, he gave it all up and moved to New Amsterdam. This should not be a total surprise. He would have been very comfortable in that environment. I mean, frankly, I would think he would have been more comfortable in New Amsterdam amongst the Dutch than the English colony anyways. It also should not have been a big surprise in that day either. I mean, 2 years prior, in 1642, he had leased a tobacco plantation on Long Island. Now, he never lived there, but he must have been thinking a lot about transfer at that point. Guy Chet, in his book, Conquering the American Wilderness, who I've already quoted earlier in this episode, summed up this current time, this transition in Underhill's life by stating this, quote, later banished from the colony with other Hutchinsonians, he moved to the territory of New Hampshire before returning to Massachusetts in 1640. There, following a ceremony of public humiliation, which we discussed, he was forgiven, but was never again welcome in the colony. Ever on the move, he spent a year in the service of the fledgling town of Stamford, Connecticut. A restless and adventurous man, Underhill was dissatisfied and bored with defensive assignments. Thus, in 1643, he sought and received a commission in New Netherland. End quote. We'll see he had a full second life, a second career in New Netherlands. He was involved in some very big events, as big or bigger as anything that he had been a part of in the English colonies, both administratively and militarily. These stories will have to wait for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really made the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.